Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree and today I'm doing my list of the top 25 video game consoles of all time. And this is a pretty good list. I got some good systems on here and I'm going to talk briefly about each one and what I like about them and, just what I think about them. So number 25 is Neo Geo. Neo Geo is a hella expensive game console that I never owned and likely never will. But it's neat because it was an arcade system in your living room. Like a literal arcade in your living room. The cartridges were huge. And they were the same graphics, sounds, everything. They were the exact arcade versions. They weren't ports. They were the arcade game on a cart in your house. And I think that's pretty cool. Number 24 is the TurboGrafx 16. When I was a kid, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, thereabouts, I wanted a TurboGrafx 16. As time went on, I learned more about it, I learned more about the games on it, and I lost interest in it. But I still think it's a fascinating footnote in gaming history. And, if I ever won the lottery or came into a fortune, I would still pick one up and get some games for it. Number 23 is the Sega Game Gear. I put the Game Gear here because I'm not a big fan of handhelds, but this is one that I have owned in the past and would own again if I ever got an opportunity. Game Gear is cool because it's full color, it's 8-bit, it looks like, Nintendo games, but handheld form. It's got a lot of good, fun games on it. And it's a neat system. Even though the TV tuner no longer works because of the switch from NTSC to ATSC, it's still cool that it did exist at one point in time. Well, it still exists. And it did work at one point in time. So there is that. Number 22 is the Magnavox Odyssey 2. I never owned an Odyssey 2, but I had a neighbor who did. And she would let me, she was an elderly woman at our church, she would let me and my sisters come over to her house and play on the Odyssey 2, because that's what you did back then. Because, it was like, presumably it was for her grandkids or whatever. But anyways, yeah, the Odyssey 2. I thought it was cool because it was kind of like an Atari 2600 in that graphically the games were similar and the controllers were sort of similar, had some similarities, I should say, but also it had a keyboard, and I thought that was cool because it was almost like a computer, and I thought that was pretty cool. Number 21 is the Microsoft Xbox 360, and I'm going to go ahead and spoil the list. There are no other Xbox consoles on this list, and if you've watched my video on why I hate the Xbox, you may understand why. So why did the 360 make the list at number 21? Well, I'm a tremendous fan of the 2000 to 2008 era of video games. So during that era of video games, we got PS2, GameCube, Xbox, PS3, Xbox 360, and Nintendo Wii, GBA, and Nintendo DS, and PSP. Those are the systems that came out in that 8-year span. And that's my favorite. That 8 years of gaming is my favorite 8 years of all the history of gaming. And the Xbox 360 happens to be among those consoles from that period. The Xbox 360 is also the only Xbox. It's not the only one I've ever owned, because I did have an original Xbox 2 at one point in time in the past. But it's the only one I want to collect for. If I ever get ahead and I ever get to the point where I can collect video games again, I would like to get an Xbox 360 and buy games for it again, because I had a lot of games for it in the past and I thought it was fun. You can get a lot of the same games that are on the PS3 on the Xbox 360. Sometimes the 360 versions are different. They have different content. So those are pretty cool. Number 20 is the Game Boy Advance. Now, I put Game Boy Advance on the list because this is the culmination of all the Game Boys. So, there is no Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, none of those are on. It's Game Boy Advance is the Game Boy. It's to me, it's the one that plays all the games. So it's the one to get. And there's no reason to own the old ones when this one exists. I had a Game Boy Advance. I never had an SP. And if I ever got an opportunity to buy one again, I would probably get both, a GBA and an SP, but I'm lumping them all together under GBA. Number 19 is the Nintendo DS. I got a Nintendo DS at launch. It is one of a handful of game consoles I've ever bought at launch. And I don't regret it. I had it for a year and a half or 2 years thereabouts, and then I traded it up for a DS Lite, and I kept it for a while before getting rid of it for reasons I won't get into here. The DS is a great system with a lot of games. It is backwards compatible with the GBA. It introduced a lot of the casual games. Now, Nintendo's handhelds have always had casual games on them, but it really opened up the casual market and helped, pave the way for the Wii, which was that period in Nintendo's time where they were chasing the blue ocean. Alright. And I screwed up. Number 18 is the Mattel Intellivision. The Intellivision was the next-gen counterpart to the Atari 2600. It was the more powerful system. It had better, well, I shouldn't say better, but more advanced controller with more options. And it had, allegedly, next-gen video games. They had better graphics, better sounds, etc. Now, as far as original games go, Mattel themselves didn't do a lot with the Intellivision, so the original games are mostly just knockoffs of games that were already on the Atari systems anyways. So you're not going to get anything special out of the Intellivision, but I think the system itself is cool and worth collecting and owning and worth talking about, whereas the games library itself is more of the same. Number 17 is the Sega Master System. Now, the Master System is tricky because as a US-based console, it kind of sucks. But it is compatible with European games, there are several European exclusives. It is compatible with the Brazil exclusives, which it had an incredibly long life in Brazil. And it is, I believe, compatible with the SG-1000, which is the Japanese version, and so some of those games should play on it as well. I'm not sure. The Master System is kind of cool because you have 8-bit versions of Sega classics, and you have alternative versions of some popular Nintendo games. Number 16 is not my favorite console of all time, but it's my most wanted console of all time, meaning it's the one I've never owned. Every game console on this list I have owned at some point in time. I've never owned a 3DO. Never. I'm 41 years old. I have been in game stores, pawn shops, comic book shops, video game conventions. I have been where games and gamers congregate. In my entire life, I have never seen a 3DO. A physical 3DO for sale in stores, in a used video game store, or on the shelf, or at a market, or wherever, anywhere, ever. Never in my entire life. I have never come across a 3DO in the wild. They're that fucking rare. I love the Sony PlayStation. I love the Nintendo 64. I love the Sega Saturn. I love the Sega CD. That era of gaming is my second favorite era of gaming. The 3DO is like a more advanced Sega CD, a less advanced Saturn PlayStation. Meaning it's like a bridge between the two. It's halfway between the two. It's got some good games. I have played 3DO games. In that one, I've used an emulator to play literal, actual 3DO games. And a lot of the games that were on the 3DO have PlayStation ports, and I was able to play those identical games on the PlayStation, which is essentially the same game. But I love the 3DO. I think it's really cool, and I think it's really fun. And it's really neat in the history of gaming. A neat footnote in the history of gaming. Number 15 is the Nintendo 64. Yes, last week I just did a video on why the N64 sucks. But I still love it. And I love it because of one game. Super Mario 64. If I only buy a Nintendo 64 and the only game I ever get for it is Super Mario 64, I will be happy with my purchase. That's not to say there aren't other games for it that I like. There are. And I could probably make a list of the top 25 N64 games at some point down the road. There are enough games on the N64 that I do actually like it. My beef with it is at the time it didn't have enough games to justify it being my only console. So it annoyed me. It irritated me. But I still enjoy it, and I still think it's a cool system, and I do think it's a good system. Number 14 is the ColecoVision. Now you're scratching your head. Do you really like the ColecoVision better than the N64? Yes, I do. And the reason for that is the ColecoVision had some unique games for it for the time. And it is another Atari era game console, and I am fascinated by the Atari era of video games, and I think the ColecoVision is one of the better consoles from that time period. Number 13, similarly, is the Atari 5200. Mostly what I like about the 5200 is it's a 4-player controller, 4-controller port system, and it has some unique innovations for the time. And the games on the N64 are Atari games that look closer to the arcade counterparts that they're ported from. So it's actually a pretty cool system. Number 12 is the Wii U. Again, I've already done a video shitting on the Wii U. The problems I have with the N64 are the same problems I have with the Wii U. By and large, there's not a lot of games for it. It's very hard to find a game for it. And I bought it at launch. I paid $400 for a Wii U. Got it at launch. And kept it all the way until the Switch came out. In fact, I would still have it to this day if it hadn't gotten stolen. My Wii U was stolen. So, there's nothing I can do about that. Some asshole stole it. Took it right, just took off with it. I would still have a Wii U to this day if it hadn't been stolen. There were a handful of good games for the Wii U. But again, like Mario 64 on the N64, I really like Super Mario 3D World. Now, the reason why this is higher up on the list is because there were actually more games on the Wii U that I enjoyed than there were on the N64. I really enjoyed Hyrule Warriors. I really enjoyed Captain Toad. I really enjoyed Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, Splatoon, NES Remix, Mario Maker, the list goes on. There were a lot of good games on the Wii U. Just not enough at the time, and it had zero third-party support. I mean, essentially. It had less third-party support than the N64 did. Not counting the eShop, and I don't count the eShop, and I'm not going to get into why. Number 11, I'm a Sega gamer. And like I said, I really like the 32-bit CD era of gaming. It's my second favorite era of gaming. I love the 32X. I know it only had a handful of games. 34, 35, depending on if you were, or 37, depending on if you were in the US, the UK, or Japan. But it's still a cool system. Now, I do not consider the 32X its own console. I consider it an add-on to the Sega Genesis, because that's essentially what it is. So that's a whole nother video for a whole nother day. But I think the 32X is cool. It's got some fun games. Mortal Kombat 2, Primal Rage, Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000, Cosmic Carnage, Colibri, Tempo. Shadow Squadron, Star Wars Arcade, Doom, etc. Some good games on the 32X. Now we're into my top 10. My top 10 is going to look like you would expect, but there are going to be some surprises, starting with number 10. Number 10 is the Sega Saturn. I just got done saying I'm a Sega fan. If I like the 32X, obviously I'm going to like the Saturn, because it's essentially a 32X, just with a little more bells and whistles. I really like the the Sega Saturn, because it was an arcade behemoth, and at the time, Sega were the kings of arcade. So you had some great games like Virtua Cop, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, Daytona USA. You had Fighters Megamix. You had X-Men Children of the Atom. And then you had some good console games like Sonic 3D Blast and Mr. Bones, etc. There were some good, unique, cool, original Panzer Dragoon original games for the Sega Saturn. Number 9 is a Sega CD. I did own a Sega CD. A Sega CD is a poor man's 3DO. Essentially. Most of the games that are on the Sega CD that aren't made by Sega were the games that were on the 3DO. For the most part. So even though I wasn't able to get a 3DO and experience those games in all their glory, I was at least able to still experience a large chunk of those games. And if nothing else, Mortal Kombat CD and Sonic CD are well worth owning. And yes, I did have Lunar the Silver Star, and I thought it was an interesting game. It was a fun game. Never beat it, because I haven't beat very many RPGs, but that's another story for another day. I've already talked about that. I did a whole video on it. Go check it out. Number 8 is the Super NES. I really do love the Super Nintendo. It's one of my favorite game consoles. It's in my top 10. It's one of my favorite game consoles of all time. It's one of my favorite Nintendo consoles of all time. The Super Nintendo's got some great fucking games. Some of my favorite games for the Super Nintendo: Mega Man X, Super Castlevania 4, Mortal Kombat 2, again, Primal Rage. That game keeps coming up, obviously. Super Mario World is one of my favorite games of all time. Kirby Superstar is a good one. Donkey Kong Country is a good one. Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past is a good one. There are a lot of good games on the Super NES. I had a lot of good memories for the Super NES. Now, I owned my Super Nintendo and my Sega Genesis side by side. Got the Genesis first, and then the Super Nintendo a year later. So I did spend more time with the Genesis than the Super Nintendo, but I still really loved the Super Nintendo. My two favorite Super Nintendo games are Super Mario World and SimCity. And I love the shit out of those two games. Number 7 is the Atari 2600. This one makes the list. This one's high on the list for a couple of reasons. One, this was my first game console. So I have a lot of cherished childhood memories of this game console. And this is unique in that it is the only, out of all of them, successful Atari console. This was the console that put Atari on the map. Also, I like asteroids. but I do not like the arcade version of Asteroids. I like the 2600 version of Asteroids, and there is a huge difference between the two. I also like Pitfall. I also like Haunted House. You know what? Fuck it. I actually like E.T. I think it's a fun game. I don't understand all the hate it gets. It's a fun game. You don't have to be able to beat a game to enjoy it. I do not beat 90% of the games I play. I still enjoy them. I don't have to beat a game to enjoy it. I had a lot of fun with the Atari 2600. Number 6 is the Sony PlayStation. I got my Sony PlayStation on my 18th birthday, and I had a tremendously good time with it. I still own a Sony PlayStation, and I still own quite a few of the big titles. I still own some PlayStation. In fact, I have almost 100 PS1 titles. So yeah, I still play a lot of PS1 games. Final Fantasy VII, obviously, I've already talked about that. Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Tekken 3, Gran Turismo 2, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon. These are all good games. There's a lot of good games on the Sony PlayStation. Number 5 is the PS3. Now, PS3, I like it for different reasons than I like the other PlayStation consoles. Mostly, I like it as an entertainment player. It is still, to this day, the best multimedia entertainment player. And the reason I say that is because it is compatible with entertainment platforms and mediums that subsequent game consoles are not compatible with. And I'm not going to get into the specifics here. Also, it's one of the better Blu-ray players. Yes, I have a PS4. It's a damn good Blu-ray player in its own right, but the PS3 is a better Blu-ray player for different reasons. It has features and options the PS4 doesn't have. It was a premium Blu-ray player. The PS4 was just a standard Blu-ray player. But the PS3 is a good console because it does have some good games as well. Like I said, the Xbox, a lot of the games that are on the PS3 were also on the Xbox 360. So I've already talked about the Xbox 360, and I'm going to talk about the PS3. There are still some good games. Like Mass Effect is a good one. Grand Theft Auto 4 is a good one. The Last of Us is a good one. This was a PS3 game. There are a lot of other good ones. I can't even think of them all off the top of my head. There's a lot of good games in this year. Red Dead Redemption is a good one, etc. Number 4 is the PS4. Now, I don't like the PS4 as much as the PS3 as a multimedia entertainment system because the PS3 has functions that the PS4 lacks. But I like it better as a game console. I like it better as a game console because, one, it has a superior version of Minecraft. And I'm obsessed with Minecraft. And 2, it's got the better controller. And 3, a lot of the big titles, the big fun titles that were on the PS3 have HD remasters on the PS4. Even though technically they were HD on the PS3 anyways, they're better on the PS4. And Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is a fucking awesome game. I play it a lot. Number 3 is the PS2. Obviously, I'm just sitting here going through the PlayStation consoles. PS2 makes number 3 because it's the best system that Sony has ever made. It was a damn good DVD player back in the day, a damn good CD player back in the day. Again, the games were fucking phenomenal. I'm not even going to sit here and try to list them all. There are just too fucking many of them to list. And the controller was pretty damn good. Number 2, Sega Genesis. I got my Sega Genesis for my 12th birthday. And I'll do a whole video on Sega Genesis down the road. Sega was the very first console that my parents ever bought me that belonged to me. It was mine. I owned it. I didn't have to share it with my sisters. This was my system. Some of my favorite video games of all time are on the Sega Genesis. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic 3D Blast, Turrican, Mega Turrican, X-Men, X-Men 2, Jurassic Park, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Disney's Aladdin, what else? Mortal Kombat 1, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, Castlevania Bloodlines, Dungeons and Dragons Warriors of the Eternal Sun, Shining Force, Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkatron. The list goes on. I could sit here and list Sega Genesis games all day long. Number one is going to kind of come out of left field. I've already talked about the N64, the Super NES. I've already talked about the Wii U. I'm hard on Nintendo. I'm very harsh on Nintendo. Yes, my number one game console is a Nintendo console. I'm harsh on Nintendo because their third-party support, by and large, sucks since the Super NES. And I'm harsh on Nintendo because they keep making major fuck-ups. Cartridges on the 64, no online on the GameCube. Whatever the fuck the Wii U was. The Wii itself. There's a lot of things about what Nintendo does that I don't like. But this one game console they did is not only rises above all of that. It rises above everything. It is my absolute favorite game console of all time. It's the one I miss. If I only ever buy one game console, this is the one I will buy and collect for. This is the one I want the most. It's the Nintendo GameCube. The GameCube is the fucking shit. It is the best thing Nintendo has ever done in their entire history of gaming. It's the best thing they've ever done. The best games Nintendo has ever made were on the GameCube. The Game Boy Player was fucking awesome. The e-reader was fucking awesome. I fucking love the GameCube. I had over 100 games for the GameCube back in the day when it was new. I was all in on GameCube. Star Fox Adventures, Super Mario Sunshine, Super Monkey Ball, Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg, Sonic Adventure DX, Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, Harvest Moon A Wonderful Life, Dr. Muto, I could talk about GameCube all day long. Super Smash Bros. Melee. And on and on and on and on. The GameCube is the greatest fucking game console ever. And I love it, and I miss it, and I would give anything to own a GameCube again.